Hey everybody, I hope all of you are staying safe and well. I just finished up a day at Mercy. We had another beautiful day of sharing food and clothing and very little rain, so that was a good thing. We're celebrating 15 years of being a church community and sharing some of our stories and our songs. Today I'm going to share a little bit with you about what we talked about on Sunday in our sermon. I'm going to start by reading the passage. It's a short one, but that'll open up the conversation for what we talked about. So we looked at the gospel passage, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, beginning in verse 13. Listen along. Now when Jesus came to the area of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the human one is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the other prophets." He said, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus replied, "Happy are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because no human has shown this to you. Rather, my Father who is in heaven has shown you. I tell you that you are Peter, and I'll build my church on this rock. The gates of the underworld won't be able to stand against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Anything you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. Anything you loosen on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anybody that he was the Christ. The word of our Lord. So in our community, we believe that everyone is a theologian. You don't have to have a degree, you don't have to have been to seminary to know about God. Being a theologian just means you think about and talk about God. And particularly, we like to talk about God in community. And I think we learn a lot from each other. I can read this passage by myself and be like, what is Jesus talking about here? But when I read it with my community, we figure things out together. So after we read this passage, instead of me just talking at everybody, we open it up for questions. Like, what stands out to you? What do you think about this passage? What do you think is going on? What are your theological insights? And the questions that came up in our community this week were, wow, Jesus is giving Peter a lot of power here. And Peter's sometimes a goofball. Like, he doesn't always get it right. What's up with that? I mean, Peter is being entrusted with a lot here. How does that work? And if Peter is being entrusted, does that mean even someone like me could be entrusted? And we talked a little bit about, that Peter doesn't always get it right. Peter isn't perfect. Peter is gonna deny Jesus. Peter wasn't perfect before this, and he isn't perfect after. But what Peter does do in this moment is he sees Jesus for who he really is. Jesus, a revelation of God. A revelation of God just means that Jesus is the flesh and blood that showed the very heart of God. Jesus shows us what God is about. And you could easily miss it because I think, like many of us, we look for God in big things. We want lightning bolts or someone to come in on a white horse. We want big miracles. We want to see things that we're like, I know that was God. And instead, God revealed Godself to God's people by being a poor human being who was killed like a criminal, who did little things that a lot of people would probably be like, well, that's not really changing the world. All he's doing is, feeding a couple people. All he did was sit down and have a conversation with a woman. Big deal, right? But we see that that is how God revealed Godself to us. In these relational, very human ways. And in this moment, Peter sees that and knows that. And Jesus entrusts him with a lot of power. And Jesus entrusts us with that power too, because we also have the opportunity to see Jesus right in front of us. in the living, breathing human beings right before our eyes. We talked about, several members of the community talked about, you know where we see Jesus? You know where we see God revealed? We see God revealed in the relationships being formed on the lawn of St. John's that so blessedly lets us use their space. We see it every time that somebody gets what a human body needs: food, shelter. I see it in the human beings that are being offered sanctuary on the steps of St. John's. That's where I see God at work. And yeah, it's not huge, but it does matter because God cares about human bodies. We also talked about, how Jesus talks about Peter being the foundation, that this insight of seeing who God really is, that this insight is the foundation of the church. And we talked a little bit about foundations, and some members from the community were like, wow, we're not really thinking about a building, are we? Because the church back then, they didn't even have buildings. And I think that really resonates with our community, who doesn't have a building of our own. And many people in the community were like, how fascinating is it that we have like complete like architectural styles that are only for churches? And this early church, like, they didn't have buildings. They met wherever they could. They met on the streets, they met in houses, they met in living rooms, they met in catacombs. And Jesus here is just walking around talking to people. And we talked about how the foundation that we want to build isn't so much about a building. The foundation that we want to build is relationships between human beings. We want to build relationships where human beings see one another for the image of God that they are created in. We want to build relationships where human beings value one another's lives, where human beings want wellness and wholeness for one another, where we want goodness for our neighbors, where seeing someone sleeping on the sidewalk doesn't invoke a feeling of fear in you, but you say, I want them to have housing because every human being deserves to have a place to sleep at night. That's the foundation that we want to build. And so we as a community, not just any one pastor, any one leader, we as a community right then and there talked about how our commitment was that even if we ever get a building of our own someday, we don't ever want that to be the priority. If you ever let your building become more important than the care of human beings, maybe you've lost sight of what the foundation of the gospel is about. If you ever are more worried about liabilities than human beings, than the lives and well-being of human beings, maybe you've lost sight of what the gospel challenges us to do, even when it's risky, even when it's scary. So our community said, you know what? We don't have a building right now, but this is a church right here, and we are committed to one another. If we ever do have a church building, we want to continue to make our foundation to be the relationship between human beings and God, because that is a firm foundation. Never want to lose sight of that. So it was a great conversation. So if any of these things excite you even a little, I invite you to come keep listening to our conversations, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also come join us anytime. We are meeting 5 days a week on the lawn of St. John's Lutheran Church right here in Atlanta. And we are gathering with masks and social distancing and safely caring for one another. Peace of Christ be with you. Thanks.